Hello, I am Nicola Vivian and I am here to talk about codependence. My book here, which is called My Will by Nicola Vivian, is my story about loving addicts and how I learnt to love in a codependent way. So I thought we would talk a little bit about how we do learn to love and how we can have healthier relationships. I'll share with you some of my experiences and things that I've learned, because I think that in the last few months we've learned that sharing connects us, and that connection is super important. Life is all about connection and relationships. We are in relationship with something or someone all of the time, including with ourselves. Sharing feelings and experiences connects us through empathy and through understanding, and that lifts emotional isolation. Remember this when you are bottling things up inside you. Expression is the opposite of depression. Now, your inner voice is a whisper, but it has the loudest impact on your outside world, your life. It is what steers you in life, and it creates the atmosphere of your inner world. And that is your normal, your reality. If your outside world is filled with drama and arguments and catastrophe and abuse, your inner voice is probably a negative one. It's likely to be harsh and judgmental with a "I'm not good enough" type of a voice or tone. And with this voice, you are at risk of all sorts of mental health disorders like addiction and depression and anxiety and self-harm. But where does it come from, and why do we have this inner voice? It comes from trauma or negative experience. It comes from fear. When my son was little, he had a monster that haunted him and stopped him sleeping, and this monster made an awful banging noise inside his head. Well, he learnt through his therapist that in fact the monster was of his own creation. It was fear, and the banging noise was his heartbeat. And that showed him and me that, we create, through our inner fears, we create our own monsters. And if that is the case, then we can surely get rid of them just as easily. Fear is really, I think, at the bottom of all our mental health disorders and also many relationship issues. Let's look at codependence and addiction and see where fear fits into that. Addiction is a dependence on something that makes your present moment tolerable, even if the rest of your life is being mucked up by it, like your relationships and your work and your day-to-day management of it. It's something that's learned over time. It doesn't happen overnight. And it stems from negative experience, usually in childhood, like loss, abandonment, abuse, family dysfunction, trauma. When you're little, you're so attached to your parents for your survival that when they're not there for you emotionally or physically, you don't have the experience or the wherewithal to say to yourself, well, maybe they're going through a tricky patch that's unrelated to me. When you're a child, everything relates to you. And because of that, you then turn the blame inwards. You must have failed at something. You must have done something wrong. And overnight, fear of failure or of not being good enough has replaced the comfort of your previous inner world. You now have a new inner voice that's harsh and critical. And that negative self-image grows and becomes your normal, your reality. It's really horrid or uncomfortable to live in that sort of normal, so you find ways to escape. You drink, you do drugs, you shop or gamble, or you have masses of sex, or you starve, or you love codependently. Perfectionism is another addictive behaviour. It is your escape from the fear of not being enough by making your outer self all shiny and glossy and perfect. Conditions like anorexia often develop from perfectionism. It did so with me when I messed up my O-levels, which really hit my confidence and sort of confirmed my belief that I was absolutely useless. So I stopped eating, and controlling my body gave me control over my fears and my self-contempt. And also to be achieving something was really quite intoxicating in a world where it was just filled with failure or a sense of failure. Codependence, not being tangible like picking up a glass of wine, is harder sometimes to define as an addiction, but it's either a chemical dependency in a relationship or an unbalanced relationship with an addict or a narcissist or an abuser. If you're codependent, you don't have mutually satisfying relationships. They are one-sided and destructive. You also confuse love and pity. You love people that you can control and that you can rescue, and you feel responsible for them and for their bad behaviours. You sacrifice your needs and lose contact with yourself. That's a very dangerous element. You have no boundaries, and you allow you allow abuse to avoid abandonment. You have very little self-esteem, but you do at the same time feel essential to your partner's recovery. Being essential is where you learned to shine when you were little. I first heard of codependence years and years ago when I phoned a rehab clinic for help to save my boyfriend's life. Now, Will, on the outside, had absolutely everything going for him, but his inside world was plagued with an inner voice that was fearful and, self-contemptuous. Because of that, he had turned to heroin. It was in the 1980s in London when heroin was quite fashionable. When I phoned the rehab clinic, I was really, really desperate because by that stage, I had done everything in my power that I could to save Will, but it still wasn't enough. He was in a bad way. He couldn't walk without a stick. The track marks across his body looked like the scars of a shark attack, and we were in and out of hospital having his legs and arms lanced because they were so badly infected. Quickly into this conversation with these rehab guys, I realised that they had turned their attention away from Will and onto me, and they explained in no uncertain terms that how I loved Will was as much of an addiction as heroin was to him. And that completely shattered me. I mean, how I loved was as much part of me as breathing. So telling me how I loved was wrong was a bit like scrunching me up and tossing me in the bin. I was also bewildered because I kept thinking, well, how can love be wrong? If isn't giving your all to someone worthy and glorious? It had also never occurred to me that there were other ways to love, or other normals to be had. But I started questioning everything then, and I looked at my way of loving, and I looked at my roots, and for that I looked at my dad. If you are in a codependent relationship, or if you are codependent, once you understand from where it originates, you will be on the first step to your recovery. So my dad, what happened with me is that he left me when I was very little, and I took that to mean that I wasn't good enough for him to want to hang around. He, on the other hand, was absolutely perfect. He was not only handsome and clever and funny, but he was absent, and we all know what absence does to the heart. He was also an alcoholic. He was prone to depression and tearfulness, and the times that I did spend with him were very highly charged emotionally, and he would plop his head down on my lap in the afternoons and he would sob about my mama having left him. All I can do is look down the barrel of my shotgun, he would say to me over and over again. So his shotgun loomed over me, coupled with feelings of not being good enough for him. So my solution was to make myself perfect. Number one, I had to save him from his gun, which meant that I had to be not just a daughter, but a mum and a friend and a nanny or a caretaker. Number two, I had to be a tip-top perfect human being. I had to be the very, very best at absolutely everything. At school, at sports, I had to be also the prettiest, the thinnest, the most popular. And that way I figured that, well, he'll be so overawed by me, he wouldn't be able to not love me. My way of loving soon it evolved into a sort of job for which I had to attain the best marks, the best results. I was responsible for, or I felt responsible for, saving a sinking ship, no matter how hurt or lost or abandoned I got in the process. In fact, my normal was being hurt and lost and abandoned. That is exactly what love meant to me. But I was blind because I was, with or without me, the ship was always going to sink. My rescuing always failed. And yet each time I failed, I would step up to the plate to try that much harder, to be that much better, so that I would eventually succeed. But I never did. Still, my bar kept rising, for myself, whilst the standards that I accepted from others kept dropping. My rescue of Will failed conclusively, sadly, when he died of an overdose. He had been dead for at least 6 hours when I found him, and his body had turned blue and stiff. So enmeshed was I in him and his life, I was totally unable to accept him going. I was 24, and my life in my eyes had ended. Without him, I was nothing. I had no identity at all, and my failure was incomprehensible. I had given my all, yet still I hadn't been good enough to save him. Codependents really need to learn about boundaries, and depending on the nature of their relationships, tough love. After my famous chat with my rehab clinic, I practiced tough love on Will. I must say I wasn't very good at it. I would leave the telephone to ring when he rang. I would leave the doorbell buzzing when he buzzed. I would leave his flowers on the doorstep, and when he sent me letters, I would run my fingers over his handwriting before I threw them away. It was hell. And then, of course, I worried when he stopped the attention, I worried that he had run off with somebody else, or worse, overdosed. Had I known right from the beginning the language of boundaries, I'd have been much better off. Boundary setting is, I think, the tool with which we change the shape of relationships. Imagine yourself and your partner as two little trees. Think about how you grow together. Do you grow up and up and up regardless of the other trees' branches, or are you leaning in to your other next door tree? How do you grow? I as a codependent, leant so far over into my next door tree, into my partner's tree, that I uprooted myself completely and lost contact with myself. That's what my childhood pattern was, and that was what was set in stone. So I always loved like that. To not abandon yourself is really hard work, but boundaries are what you use to do that. I had a wonderful shrink for many years who used to remind me about boundaries by saying to me, "Darling, you are not a Meals on Wheels." She was Russian, and that's not a very good Russian accent, but it was a great expression to be reminded of, and I still do to this present day. It would be so useful, I always think, if we could all have maps of life. We would see thick borders between owning a person's chaos and supporting that person. They're quite different things. I flailed around with where to set boundaries forever, really, and it always seemed to be just too difficult or too frightening. So instead I would just succumb to waiting around for the good times to happen in a relationship, or normalize situations that other people would consider abusive, and repress my feelings endlessly for fear of rejection. That was my normal. Making a new normal with boundaries required me to know where when my relationship was wrong. Things like subtle put-downs or playing on my inadequacies, controlling me, conversations that felt like competitions, or being lied to. I absolutely hate being lied to. Things like that were the starting points of, where I should set boundaries, where I would begin to hurt. But my problem was that I was so lost, I didn't really know when I was hurting. I had never given any value to my feelings, because as a child of an alcoholic, your feelings don't matter that much. It's the feelings of the alcoholic that consume the family. The only feelings that were so loud and clear in my head were those related to not being good enough. That was my normal. So I embarked on a search for a new normal, and my goal, I think, was to have mutually giving and respectful relationships, to be talked to in a nice way, have a nice time, feel cherished, I suppose. That would have been a first. I had to make, initially though, I realised I had to make a healthy relationship with my inner voice. So I asked myself, who am I? What makes me happy and healthy? If I were a tree, are my roots growing in healthy soil or trauma-logged soil? If they're growing in trauma-logged soil, my roots are going to be full of fear. Fear of failure, not being good enough, lovable enough, fear of loss, rejection, abandonment. Fearful roots make a trunk that's weakened by low self-esteem and a negative inner voice, and that makes branches that grow into things like depression and anxiety and addiction and missed opportunities and bad relationships and a horrid life. You have to really listen, I think, to yourself, and listen to your likes and your dislikes and what makes you happy and unhappy. You have to listen hard to the voice that's underneath that negative inner voice. You have to feel how you feel, understand it. There's no right or wrong to any of our feelings. Feelings are not rational, and they all deserve value. They'll differ wildly from other people's feelings, but that doesn't matter. Who cares? Most of us grow up thinking that our feelings are wrong. We've been told that they're wrong, probably by our parents, but feelings don't require judgment. They shouldn't be judged. They just require compassion. And fear requires compassion. So figure out your shape, what makes you tick. Some of us have been so busy people-pleasing that we really don't know what our shape is. I was one of those. Being honest about yourself is quite hard, because there are many things about ourselves that we don't really want to admit to. And for instance, I thought that my selflessness had no motives, because motives didn't really match my perfection narrative. But in fact, behind every choice there are motives. Everyone has motives, or at least their behaviours, which originate from childhood, have motives, because it's said that a child's basic needs and motives are three things: affection, approval, and attention. My childhood needs for those three played out in me mopping up my dad's dramas, which awarded me a nugget of attention. And a nugget of attention goes a long way when you have no self-esteem. Mopping up drama later on in life evolved from those childhood patterns, but just turned into slightly different shapes. I would sit, for instance, in my car on dark boarded up streets, waiting for Will to score from armed dealers, late into the night after night, for hours, and I hated it. I was terrified. But my normal was being essential to the saving of Will, convinced as I was that he would crash the car if he drove back stoned on his own. With a dysfunctional background, your inner voice is often coated as well in victimhood and your inner world in false realities. Knowing I had the addictive gene, I think, really fed into my victim narrative. You know, I would always think, oh, why me? Or just my luck to have this gene, as if I had no control over it. Well, I did. I mean, studies show conclusively that the addictive gene can be switched off with nurturing relationships, nurturing parenting, nurturing understanding, empathy, love. Of course, it's easier to blame other people for things, and that way you're always right and you're always faultless. But if you do that, you will always remain the victim, and that is as good as imprisoning yourself. Because when you take responsibility for everything that happens to you in life and for how you respond to it, you have control over your life. Finally, I mean, that is the most liberating thing that I discovered. So, take control, take responsibility. False realities are the false inner worlds you create to avoid the pain of what is really going on. When my dad was drunk on the floor, we would chat to him as if he was sitting at the table. We were reordering our inside worlds by normalizing our outside one. We were seeking a reality that we could make sense of. And I repeated the same pattern with Will. I decided that eating 2 home-cooked meals a day would convince us both that we were leading normal lives and we were normal people. And even when Will's head was in his soup, I was able to magically con myself that all was well and jolly and normal. Mad. So I have shared a little of the normal that I grew up with, which is really, really common amongst children from dysfunctional backgrounds. The bottom line is fear of sorts. Be careful not to let fear make you squeeze yourself into all sorts of shapes just to please someone or to avoid rejection. There's a huge difference between doing something for someone's approval and doing something that you just love doing. So listen to you. Listen to your inner voice. Hear what it thinks of you. See how it impacts your life. Do you refuse invitations because you think you're not acceptable enough? Do you think you're not worthy of proper love, so choose people who abuse you? When you shine a light on your inner world, pretend it's a store cupboard stocked with jars that are way past their sell-by dates. None of them serve you anymore. They probably never did. People talk about conquering their demons, but I like to think that you can just let them go. Fear serves us only in times of real danger. Look at the fear that you have, understand it, and let it go. Letting go of fear shifts your mindset. You'll realize after a while that you're on another track now, living a new normal. Unlike your old normal, which was drama-packed, it will feel balanced and calm. It won't be without challenges, because life never is, but your responses to them will be measured and solution-driven. With value and credence given to your feelings, you will walk away from and say no to anything and everything that doesn't feel comfortable to you. Your feelings will automatically become your boundary setting barometer. And like this, you'll attract people into your life that respect your boundaries, who are right for you. Your relationships will be more balanced. So, be you. Keep listening to you. Give value to how you feel. Own who you are. Own your motives. Own your victimhood. Own your false realities. Accept yourself as different from others and they from you. We're like the ingredients of a wonderful stew, all different but all essential to its overall flavour. With so much recent suffering and death, you and we owe it to ourselves and our loved ones to lead healthy and more balanced lives and relationships. The greatest healer on our journey is compassion. Know always that the inside worlds of others are vulnerable and plagued with self-doubt and fear, just as yours is. Be kind. Everyone has an inner voice. And on a relationship note, I will leave you with Two Little Trees and Khalil Gibran. Give one another of your bread, but eat not from the same loaf. Stand together, yet not too far. The oak tree and the cypress grow not in each other's shadow. Thank you so much for listening. Good luck. Bye.
If you like that video, there are loads more talks, classes and exclusive videos from the Happy Place Virtual Festival. So don't forget to subscribe on YouTube. Do follow us on Instagram for constant updates and enjoy.